Welcome and thank you for stopping by Sheila's Audiobooks, and I am Sheila. This recording is coming from South Texas. All stories on this recording are in the public domain per United States copyright law. This story is about the Cornelian ring. A young girl, not more than 20, pleasing as any fair Englishwoman of her breed and age, her cousin Basil, who she had been destined as his bride ever since she was a little child, and Featherstonehaugh Manor-house, which she had never left in all her life. She loved the place with an ardent response to all the careful training she had received to love and revere it, and now it was all vanishing before her very eyes. Can she stop this terrible thing from happening? Sir Basil and Rue. Number 489. A Cornelian ring engraved with a woman's head, probably antique, brass setting. This is how the item is entered in the old catalogue. The ring lies carelessly in the corner of a long dusty glass case. Near is a fragment of an Etruscan necklace, the fine filigree work broken into shreds. Occupying the center of the case is a shriveled and half-unwrapped mummy of a sacred ibis, and another object of horror, the dried head of a Maori chief with hard-painted cheeks and long tufts of coarse black hair. If anyone should chance to glance here, the interest of these ghastly relics would obscure that of the Cornelian ring, dull under the dust, with the setting dirty and tarnished. Yet once it played a part in a tale at once romantic and pleasant. Once it was bright and polished and handled by youthful fingers, and treasured as an antique fresh from the new-ploughed vineyards of the Roman Campagna, though a later judgment considered its pretensions doubtful and the label as dubious. This is the story of the Cornelian ring. The date is the date of the one English Regency. The scene is first in Kent, and the curtain goes up on the figure of a young girl walking along the terrace of a fine old manor house. She was a young girl, not more than 20, and pleasing as any fair Englishwoman of her breed and age, slender, erect, self-composed, delicate-featured, with wide grey eyes more than a little discontented in expression. Her name was Ruth Fairfax, and as she had been destined for her cousin's bride ever since she was a little child, and his name was Basil, some fantasy had shortened her name into Rue. Basil and Rue. They had always been as children playing together, Basil and Rue, at the formal betrothal and during the few months of their position as serious lovers. And they were Basil and Rue to each other now when they wrote to each other, he from London, she from Featherstonehaugh Manor-house, which she had never left in all her life. Nor was she ever intended to leave it. She had been bred with that one idea that she was to be the wife of Basil and the mistress of the manor. Early an orphan, Basil's mother had brought her up, and her not inconsiderable fortune had gone in acquiring fresh land round Featherstonehaugh, and in improving the property which was one day to be hers, which was, in fact, partly hers now. And she loved the place with an ardent response to all the careful training she had received to love and revere it, with a keen sense of all the tradition it stood for, the fine life it was symbolic of, and she asked nothing better than the destiny prepared for her to reign over Featherstonehaugh as she had been taught to reign. She looked over the noble sweeps of lawn broken by magnificent beech and yew trees, that extended to the great iron gates, then glanced up at the house, built under the Tudors and turreted, and now stately under a sombre June sky. Then she skirted the wide terrace and walked rapidly and gracefully to the back of the mansion. There a simple garden brought its sweetness to the very arched doorways of the dwelling. There was no exotic flower, only those blooms that had flourished here almost as long as the Featherstonehaugh themselves, large Canterbury bells of a pale shell pink, Jacob's ladder, purple and white sweet williams, bushes of lavender, pink poppies, azure cornflowers, and the tall spikes of white lilies yet in bud. And behind this border grew the roses, now in full glory, heavy crimson blooms amid deep crimson foliages, roses with sulphur hearts, blush roses with sea-green leaves, and rambling roses of white and crimson, minute and multitudinous among the fine trails of green. Among these roses walked a tall lady, snipping the faded flowers into a rush basket that she carried on her arm. She wore a shawl over her gown of black and white striped taffetas, and a frilled muslin cap fastened under her chin. At the girl's approach she turned towards her a fine, thin and determined face. Rue came and stood beside her. Neither spoke. There was something ominous in this silence, as was something ominous in the grey sky and chill wind of this June day. The elder lady used her scissors vigorously, and the girl watched with the intentness of preoccupation the heavy heads of the roses fall onto the moist ground. Presently she stooped and began picking them up and placing them in the basket on her aunt's arm. Lady Fanshawe glanced at her serious face and spoke. "You heard from Basil this morning?" Rue answered as if replying to a challenge. "Yes. And I was not told?" "I was awaiting an opportunity of telling you, Aunt Helen. You have it now." The lady dropped the scissors into the basket and stood facing her niece, who had flushed at the cold tones directed to her so haughtily. But her tone also was resolute and calm as she replied. "It is time Basil returned." "I know that." Lady Fanshawe spoke frankly but with the same coldness. "He must come back." Rue pronounced the words with energy. The skirt of the dark close gown was ruffled by the wind, her fair hair blown across her brow. She looked very resolute, and, in a delicate manner, strong. The elder woman eyed her keenly. "Can you make him come back?" Rue answered slowly. "No, nor can you, Aunt Ellen." Then, reluctantly facing a contemptuous truth, "He cares no more for either of us nor for Fanshawe." Basil's mother stood as one outraged. She was speechless at this tearing aside of the veil she had hung before reality, at this ruthless leveling of the defenses her love had built round her son. Looking at her, Rue was stirred into passion. "Please let us help each other. Please let me tell you how it is he gambles." "Rigid," his mother answered. "I know all young men do." Rue was unflinching. "He plays high and loses. We can afford some losses." "Not these losses." Lady Fanshawe shivered and glanced up at the clouded sky. "What has he written to you?" she demanded on a note of surrender. "That he loses, and worse than money." "He stakes?" Rue's eyes were dark. She answered with a certain fierceness. "He begins to stake Fanshawe." The elder lady set her lips and her brow in frowning lines. She stood erect before the blow of a horrible suspicion confirmed. Just for a moment she was on the defensive, excuses, even denials, on her lips, the lifelong spirit of devotion refusing to be utterly quenched, even at this moment, which was but the climax of long weeks of trial and suspense. Then, under the straight glance of the girl, a glance which was singularly fearless and ardent, she surrendered. "Yes, Rue," she said, and her voice sounded old and uncontrolled. "You are quite right, something must be done." But there was a hopeless sound in her words, as if she said, "What can two women do against a man, who is at once their lord and their beloved?" Rue took her arm very gently and relieved her of the basket of dead roses, and the two erect, yet pitiful, figures passed from under the shadow of the grey sky into the shadow of the ancient house. In the tapestried drawing-room, proudly kept unchanged through all changes of taste and mode, they faced each other and their trouble. "It is Lord Muskerry," said Rue. Lady Fanshawe bowed her head. "I have realized that," she answered. Her manner was quite meek, the manner of one towards another who has shown the courage he himself has lacked. "That man," continued the girl with emphasis, "has Basil by the throat. He will get every penny from him and every rood of Fanshawe." Basil's mother was dumb. She was hardly prepared for this extreme facing of the situation. Basil was Basil, to be adored and reverenced, my son and master of Fanshawe, yet the energy and decision of the younger woman silenced this tradition and this pride. Deep in her stalwart heart Basil's mother was afraid. She kept her hands tight locked in her lap, and looked at Rue with an intensity that grew piteous. Rue looked at the window. The clouds had broken now and a fine rain fell on the swaying flowers. The horizon began to glow a luminous color of pearl, and in rifts in the clouds shafts of light gleamed against which the rain looked like a veil of diamonds. "It is Lord Muskerry," repeated the girl, her figure in the blue gown, straight, tight and showing the limbs. The elegant feet in the white stockings and black sandals looked incongruous against the old massive oak chair built to frame ruff and wimple, stomacher and farthingale. "He has been in the hands of Lord Muskerry," she added, "ever since he went to London. 'Twas his first friend, his ruin." "It is with Lord Muskerry he plays?" The question came reluctantly. "He himself admits it," replied Rue, with scorn. She quoted her lover's letter, "Playing with my Lord Muskerry I have been unfortunate. I staked and lost some of the Howwoods." "That is what he said." "The Howwoods," muttered Lady Fanshawe. Rue proceeded with her indictment. "Betty Morton has written the same thing to me. She says her husband hears of Basil at all the nightclubs, that he is in the foremost of every folly, every devilry in town. This has been going on for more than a year. Aunt Helen. For a year and 3 months and 2 days, dear. She had the date of her son's departure engraved in her heart. And during that time he has not once thought to visit us. His return is ever postponed and our marriage is never referred to. She turned her eyes on her aunt. She was very moved. The fair face was flushed. She was thinking of more than Basil. She was thinking of Fanshawe. Are we going to wait here while he squanders and stakes the estate? The elder lady looked at her in silence. She had no suggestion to make. She was so trained to inaction, as the only dignified course for a woman, that she could think of no alternative. Her married life had been an admirable training in patience. The late Sir Basil had had so many faults that she had hardly been able to suppress a sigh of relief at his demise, but he had not gambled beyond the ordinary trifling play of a gentleman. This was a new disaster and threatened ruin, horrors impossible to contemplate. He could never gamble. Fanshawe, she broke out suddenly. He has begun, replied Rue. This Lord Muskerry will suck him dry. Do you think that he will be content with a portion of Howard's? He will play for the whole estate. Impossible. It is very possible. Larger estates than this have been lost this way. Who is he, this Muskerry? Rue's clear eyes flashed hate. Who can he be? A greedy adventurer, a penniless peer, a fribble of fashion, a rook on the outlook for such a pigeon as Basil. Who else? Is there no one, asked Lady Fanshawe desperately, who can save Basil? One of his father's friends? Would he listen to them? You know he would not. There must be someone. I know of no one. But something must be done. The girl raised her hand impulsively and put back her soft hair. We must go to London, she said. Amazement flushed the other lady's face. We? I have not been to town since Basil's father died. We must go now. Where? To London, to the town house, to stay with Basil, to fight Lord Muskerry. Hope began to light the clouds of Lady Fanshawe's bewilderment. After all, why should they not break through the tradition that as females they should wait decorously in the country till their lord pleased to return? I believe that you are right, my dear, she said, and flushed. Basil certainly needs us, and as he will not come to us, we must go to him. Rue was thinking more of Fanshawe than of Basil. Before one rood of the manor fell into the hands of strangers, she was prepared to make a valiant fight. Bending together with interlocked hands, the women took counsel. It ended by Basil's mother drawing the girl to her bosom and crying over her. Rue did not cry at all. Within the week they were ready to start. Sir Basil had had but a day's notice of their arrival. His cousin did not wish to give him the chance to write putting them off with any excuse either specious or laboured. They did not expect the warmest of welcomes. Of late their correspondence had been cold and tinged with reproach. He would be sure to suspect their motive in this sudden unparalleled visit. He did indeed mark his displeasure by being out when they arrived at the town mansion. This disturbed Rue very little. She took command of the household, established the new servants she had brought with her, then took the coach and went shopping with her aunt in the Haymarket and the adjacent fashionable streets. She was not indifferent to the trifle of clothes. She had never looked a country miss, and now she ordered the finest gowns she had ever worn with surety and taste. Lady Fanshawe approved. She grew younger and less formal in this atmosphere. She almost enjoyed the constant spectacle of the changing crowd, but Rue wished that she was back at Fanshawe. Nothing distracted her from the one set purpose in her mind. That night Sir Basil returned so late that both the ladies were abed. The next morning his mother came into Rue's room. The girl lay yet in the heavy old bed, shadowed by folds of silk curtains. What, have you seen him? Yes, dear. So early? He was up early. I heard him come down, his voice on the stairs. I hurried down. He was going for a ride. To avoid us. He says he rides every morning. Lady Fanshawe still strove to defend him. What did he say? Oh, greeting surprise. He behaved well, asked for you. Rue was still unmollified. Could he do less? She slipped from the bed and stood in her long ruffled gown gazing at her aunt. You do not look pleased, she said keenly. He was changed? Basil's mother was startled. How did you guess? I thought that he would be lately. His letters have changed. For a little they were silent. The elder woman sat on the edge of the bed. We shall never do anything with him, she said sadly. He is so changed as all that? Demanded Rue, frowning. I am afraid so. Rue said nothing more. She braced herself to meet this Basil, so changed that his mother spoke of it. Changed indeed he must be. His betrothed had found him easy to deal with in the past, bright, laughing, good-humoured, malleable too malleable. Now another and sinister influence had moulded him. Rue felt bitter towards London, very bitter towards Lord Muskerry. If Basil had remained at Fanshawe he would not have changed, but have remained the same dear lord, the centre of their adoration and interest. That day she did not see him. She armed herself with patience, surrounded herself with such friends as there were in London, found out what she could of the formidable Lord Muskerry. She found that she had been mistaken in her estimation of him. He was no fop of fashion, no starving adventurer, but a man of wealth and distinction. He had a reputation as a diplomat, would soon be in the government, so much even his enemies admitted. Rake and gambler he might be, but this had never hindered his success nor smirched his reputation. He was spoken of as one destined to a notable career compared to Bolingbroke, was a wit, an author, a man certainly distinguished. Rue hated him the more. She had a capacity for hatred as some have for love. Often she was surprised herself at the quick passion of her feelings against some person or object who wounded or vexed her, and Lord Muskerry had done both. For he had taken from her what was most peculiarly hers, her lover, and was on the way to take from her, her fortune and her home. The first meeting with Basil was one of perfect courtesy. He behaved with a frankness that was the most perfect guard to his thoughts and feelings, and her manner had always been one of easy reserve, even towards him. But while the two exchanged commonplaces in the great drawing-room of the town mansion, she asking after the London season, he after Fanshawe, they were keenly regarding each other. It was almost the keenness of enemies, certainly it was a keenness free from all illusion and almost from kindness. He could not but approve her bloom, the glow of wind and sun in her cheeks, the clearness of her eyes, the abundant glossy hair looped round the high amber comb. Her figure, not concealed by the close gown of tight silk, was too full for his taste. A freedom in her movements seemed boldness. Her feet seemed large, though finely shaped. Her hands were browned on the backs. He noticed the scars of rose thorns on her fingers. Worse than all, she had now an air too composed, even too commanding for one who had become used to the adoration and thousand veiled flatteries of town ladies. He hesitated in his judgment, sometimes considering her a beautiful woman, sometimes as one without charm. At least she was not the country miss, awkward and shy. It was equally certain that she was not a fine lady adept in the art of fascination. In Rue's judgment there had been no hesitancy. Even before their greeting hands had parted, after the first alert glance she had said to herself, he will not do. As they sat side by side on the long yellow settee, this first swift verdict of hers was confirmed. His mother had said that he was changed. To Rue's quicker perception he had not changed but matured. She realized, with a cruel pang, that all the faults she saw in him now were always there, latent but potent. His charm had become affectation. His weakness, before unconscious, now on guard, was veiled by an air of obstinacy. He was now no longer afraid of disregarding emotions he had been awed into holding sacred, nor ashamed to own his love of folly. He spoke with a shrug of his mother, with a sneer of Fanshawe. His shallowness very completely aped the gentleman à la mode. His face had altered. The rosy freshness was changed into a thick pallor, becoming but unhealthy. The fullness of the lips and chin was emphasized. The eyes were heavy-lidded. He wore the extreme fashion, and carried himself with the air of a man who gives too much attention to his dress. "When are you returning home?" asked Rue. She used the last word with meaning. She saw that his vanity resented it. "Have you come to fetch me?" he parried. "Like a school-dame after a truant?" She considered her reply. "Well, perhaps," she said slowly. He made a movement that he could not divest of impatience. "This is my mother," he exclaimed. "Nay, it was I, Basil." "You?" The enmity in his glance was unmistakable. "I want you to come back to Fanshawe." There was no flattery in her tones. He spoke lightly to cover his vexation. "Do not be provincial, Rue. Men do not stay on their estates nowadays. London is the only place for a man of position." "What will you do in London?" "Muskerry has promised to get me a government place." "And Fanshawe?" "My dear." His tone was a protest against her insistence. "The place has a very capable steward." She locked her hands about her knees and her eyes were dark with earnestness. "You cannot afford this life, Basil." He blushed from the tight folds of his muslin cravat to the curls of his carefully arranged hair. "You are gambling," she proceeded. "You are beginning to sell the estate." He curbed the haughty answer he desired to give. She was his cousin, would be his wife, and had a large money interest in his property, and she was not displeasing to him, nor was he in love with any other woman. Also considerations and a weak desire to have a confidant moved him to take her reproofs humbly. In town one must gamble. His defense was voluble. You do not understand that yet, Rue. Muscary is a great player. It is done at all the clubs. I have my way to make and cannot hang back. Muscary is a patron worth having. He could send me to an embassy in Europe. I thought you would like that. The life of foreign courts is for the land. It is easily bought back, and the mortgages. Mortgages! She cried. She had not thought of that. Reluctantly, yet with a certain relief, he gave her the truth. Yes, the estates were mortgaged in part. Every gentleman's estates were. It meant nothing. Yes, he had been to the Jews. It was incredible how money went in town, but a man had to. There was no making a career else. Why, she did not realize the state of things. Everyone from the regent downwards was in debt. It was the way things were done. The only alternative was to rot in the country, and he couldn't do that. Didn't she understand? Rue understood. Her calmness reassured him. He left her affectionately and promised to take her riding in his white and gilt phaeton that afternoon. Rue sat for a long while silent on the satin settee. She knew all that she needed to know now. This one interview had told her everything. Gambling, debts, mortgages, these words indicated, like signposts, a wilderness of folly. How far things had gone she did not need to know. It was obviously but a question of how long it took for Fanshawe to slip through Basil's loose fingers. Rue wept in sheer passion. Her lover was gone. The boy of the past she might have loved, the man of the present never, and with her lover her future had vanished. Too small a chance had she now of reigning in Fanshawe as from her childhood she had been taught to reign. She went to Lady Fanshawe, as one going to seek comfort from an ally, but Basil had been before her. He had spoken to his mother, made excuses, told half-truths. She was again wholly his. Rue felt herself shut out. Here was one who would always adore Basil and listen to no evil of him. All would come right, she said. Basil was as other young men. Let them wait without anxiety. After all, women should not interfere. Rue felt her blood flaming. Like a poisoned dart her rage went out to Lord Muscary. She wished that she could go and seek him. Women were so chained. Basil did not come to take her out that afternoon. In the evening she saw him intoxicated. She knew that this was merely fashion, that no man was exempt, yet it increased her sense of his carelessness and folly. Next day he dined at home, his mother, the decorous hostess, delighted to receive her son's fashionable guests. Rue found herself in the window embrasure talking to a gentleman very quietly dressed in grey cloth. "You are new to London?" he asked her. "I understand London," she replied. He looked at her with interest. He liked her carriage, her air of fearlessness, her beautiful arms and shoulders. Her gown of heavy white satin with borders of gold embroidery and gold cords under the bust showed no country taste. Her robustness, which had repelled Basil, attracted him. It was like the perfume of clover, the fragrance of lavender and honey to one to whom these things had the charm of variety. "It is a little difficult to understand London," he answered. "I know," she answered him, and looked at him carefully and quite frankly. Dark he was and slender, of a type new to her, aquiline in feature, with large and powerful eyes, an air of great ease and perfect mastery of himself. He seemed amused and interested in others and absolutely self-assured. She thought there was more than a little of the devil in him. Suddenly, on a quick intuition, she said, "You are Lord Muscary." "Yes," he said. "Did you not hear my name when we were presented?" "No." "Then how did you guess?" "I do not know." They looked at one another steadily, astonished at the interest each had for each. He had never considered Basil Fanshawe with any particular attention, nor gone beyond his first summary of him as another youngster from the country, more or less foolish and more or less amusing. That his estates could not probably stand the strain of the rate he was living at, Lord Muscary guessed, but that had been no matter of his. He knew too what Rue did not know, that Basil was a born gambler, difficult, if not impossible, to save. Now he was interested in the man because of the woman. This girl was not the type he had expected the young squire's betrothed to be. He admired her, the kind of woman to help a man, he thought, but not such a man as Basil Fanshawe. "Are you long for town?" he asked. "It depends upon the success I meet with," answered Rue. She continued to give him her keen attention. She thought of him as the most dangerous enemy. As such he held her with an endless interest. He probed the frankness that pleased him. "If you succeed?" She flushed a little. "Succeed in persuading Basil to return home," she answered bluntly. "We country folk, my lord, do well to keep away from London." He looked amused. "A rare sentiment, and one that does credit to your intelligence, Miss Fairfax," she continued, speaking rapidly, as if explaining her position and her motives. She had a desire to make herself very clear with this man. "Here, Sir Basil is nothing in Fanshawe. He is something. He will never be distinguished in London. In Fanshawe he is always a great man." "You love the place," said Lord Muskerry keenly. "It is," she answered proudly, "my home and my kingdom." He was speaking to her seriously, as if they had long known each other. "You realize he is entangled?" "Yes." She dropped her glance and her lips trembled, for she wondered if it were much worse than she knew. "I think," said Lord Muskerry carelessly, "that he is much embarrassed." Rue suddenly turned on him, beating her foot on the floor and speaking in a low accent of intense rage. "This is your doing, my lord," she flung at him. "You have made this poor youth ruin your amusement, and now your boast." Lord Muskerry was sincerely astonished. He laughed in her face. "You mistake. Sir Basil is a born gambler. He plays with any who will take his stakes." "You are his tempter," returned she unappeased. He shrugged his shoulders, and looked at her with narrowed eyes. "Make the request, Miss Fairfax, and I will never play with Sir Basil again." But her pride was in arms. Vanity and loyalty to Basil combined to lead her into a foolish action. She defied instead of conciliating. "Basil is no gambler. I know him. I do not need your lordship's assistance." The dark devil that had so often borne down his opponents leapt to his eyes. "Would you challenge me, madam?" he asked very soft. "I do not need your lordship's assistance," she repeated. She told herself that this fire in her heart was hatred of the man, driving her into wildness. "You do not know Sir Basil," he said with an air of mocking. He held out his firm handsome right hand, which bore one ring, a cornelian in a brass setting. "You see this," he continued, "an almost worthless thing, though a pretty antique, but set in brass as I bought it in Italy?" "Well?" said she, breathing a little heavily, but with eyes very courageously on his dark amused face. "Well, Sir Basil would stake, when he is in his madness of play, all Fanshawe against this." The thing was too monstrous. She laughed it away. "You are at liberty, my lord, to endeavor to obtain Fanshawe at so low a rate." He bowed. Rue turned and hastened away. She was beginning to lose her composure. Certainly this man had a power, a force. She could not help comparing him with Basil, but angrily checked that disloyalty. She felt lonely in the great house, lonely in the crowd of strangers, and, for all the proud front she had shown to Lord Muskerry, utterly unprepared as to how to cope with the situation. She believed the best of Basil, but at the best he was changed. Even his adoring mother had admitted that weak he was, too, and vain and obstinate, and what was her influence over him? She could not be sure even that he still regarded her as his friend. When the reception was over she went again to his mother. "Lord Muskerry says Basil is a gambler born," she said abruptly. "These fashionable men use the term as a compliment," was the reply. There was beginning to be considerable strain of feeling between the two women. The presence of Basil had entirely lulled his mother. She could not now bear to hear anything against him. He seemed to her to be leading the life of any young man of quality in town, and she was quite satisfied with his careless assurance that the estates were safe. "The entanglement is more than we know of," continued Rue. "You cannot, will not realize it." "My dear, you listen to gossip," replied the elder lady. "If you are going to make yourself unhappy about Basil, let us go back to Fanshawe." "And wait for the day when he comes to us with empty pockets," cried Rue, "telling us that no stick nor stone on the estate is any longer ours." "This talk," said the elder lady, "is an insult to my son." Rue left her without another word. She felt hardened against both the Featherstonehaugh. Lord Muskerry and some other gentlemen dined with Basil that evening. Afterwards, as was usual, they passed into the card room. The girl, reluctantly mounting the wide staircase to the decorum of the drawing-room, gave a backward look in time to catch a glance from my lord. A glance of amusement, she thought, at a country miss who had defied him. She looked from him to Basil. Her betrothed was sober as any gentleman there. She took some comfort from that. Long after Lady Fanshawe had gone to bed and Rue was in her chamber, with her maid dismissed, the men remained in the card room. Several times she went out onto the stairs and leaning over the white baluster listened. The door was opened and shut occasionally as the servant carried in fresh bottles and glasses. She heard the voices of the gamblers, not raised, but sharp with excitement. Once she heard Lord Muskerry laugh. 1 o'clock came and she had not undressed. All her candles, save one on the dressing table, had guttered out unheeded. This last vague light showed her pale and haggard in her coral red silk. A string of garnet gleamed dark on her pale throat, and a high gold comb sparkled in her bright hair. When she moved she felt a strange pain in her head and limbs, a feverish coldness which was a heat and yet a shiver. Her complete healthiness was startled at these symptoms of weakness. She was forced to admit that this was the mind affecting the body, forced to realize how she had suffered during those hours that she had waited here, her thoughts following every incident, her imagination picturing every movement that was taking place in the card room, a room she was fast beginning to regard as fatal. She had seldom been awake, never been up and dressed. So late, she looked from the window. The silence and darkness of the city was worse than the silence and darkness of the country. The air was cold, the uncharitable cold of an English summer. She took from the press an Indian shawl, Basil's one present to her since her arrival, and put it round her shoulders. Then, without any formed resolution, she opened the door and descended the stairs. The decoration of the house was white, showing now a pale opal color in the subdued light from the silk-shrouded, crystal-hung lamps on the stairway. Rue hated this coldness. The tears rose in her eyes as she thought of Fanshawe House, that rich palace of her dreams. For a moment she paused before the card-room door, conscious that her limbs were heavy, that her head was giddy, conscious of the serene classical lines of the moulding in the panels before her. Then she opened the door and stood before the flushed party of men intent on their play. Her eyes were only for one face. In looking for Basil Fanshawe she forgot all confusion and weakness. He was close to her, leaning across the slender table, a dice box of goat's hair bound in silver grasped in his right hand. The multitudinous folds of his cravat were loosened and the billows of muslin fell in disorder over his bosom. His hair was pushed out of the fashionable arrangement of curls and hung awry on his damp forehead. His face looked quite fallen and old and ill. With every second that the girl looked at him she knew that what Lord Muskerry had told her was true. Even her inexperience could not fail to see that here was a man absorbed by the intense and overwhelming passion of the born gambler. She went straight up to him. The other men in the room did not exist for her at that moment. But they were all staring at her. None of them had paid much attention to Miss Fairfax either at the reception or the dinner, but now her sudden and strange appearance, her vivid dress, bright shawl, and unusual pallor that set off a beauty hitherto unnoticed, set all eyes on her. Play was stopped. All, with tacit consent, waited for her to declare herself. But her thoughts were only for Basil, and he was the only man who paid no attention to her. She called his name in a tone in which she had never uttered it before. Basil. He looked up, his dazed eyes showed neither surprise nor resentment at her presence. Basil. She laid her hand on his shoulder. He shook himself like a man trying to shake off sleep. "Why, you should be in bed," he said, and his gaze turned again to the dice box. Rue looked from him across the table. She saw that his opponent was Lord Muskerry, who surveyed her with a brilliant glance. She drew her breath sharply, her hand tumbled from her bosom, letting slip the Indian shawl and revealing her pale throat and shoulders with the necklace of dark lustrous stones. The other guests left their own play to gather about these three. One or two advised Basil to desist. They saw tragedy in the tired face of the woman. "You have played high enough for tonight, Sir Basil." He took no heed of these words a friend whispered in his ear. Lord Muskerry heard them and repeated them aloud. "Best play no more tonight, Sir Basil, lest you lose further." The young man lifted his head, roused at last. "What do you mean? To cheat me of my revenge? I must and will have my revenge. Luck will turn." "I'll play no more," said Lord Muskerry, but he did not move from the table. "Why do you say that?" demanded Basil, his eyes ugly. "Because I always beat you in games of hazard as in games of skill." "A good reason," said Rue. "You leave it now, Basil. Cards and dice for tonight." He looked up at her and laughed. "You have come to bring me luck, eh, Rue? To see me win what I have lost?" He turned keenly to the other man. My lord, I will play you any stakes you wish to prove my luck." Lord Muskerry took the brass-mounted ring from his finger and placed it on the table. "That against all you possess, That is the only stake I play tonight." The company drew closer round Basil. He picked up the ring and laughed unsteadily. "A fine intaglio. I always admired it. Against all that, you still possess a Fanshawe, your townhouse, your horses." "I am sure of my luck," interrupted Basil. Rue Fairfax came closer to him. The candlelight threw out her brilliant figure against the dark garments and white cravats of the men. "You are not sane tonight, Basil," she said in a voice rough with distress. "You do not know what you are doing." "I am perfectly sober, my dear," he cut in with impatience. She clasped her hands with agonized entreaty. "Basil, consider me." He looked her up and down. "I'll add you to the list," he said with an eager laugh. "What do you say to that, Lord Muskerry, the hand of this lady?" "Done," said my lord quietly. Rue leapt from the card table as swiftly as if he had struck her from her balance. An elderly man caught her arm kindly. "You must not think of him at all, Miss Fairfax. A born gambler, a reckless gambler, I fear quite worthless." Rue did not hear the words. She was listening to the clatter of the dice, then the smart smack of them on the table. Basil had thrown first. He pushed his chair back, red in the face. "Did I not tell you that my luck had changed?" He had thrown the 5 and 6. My lord cast his throw in silence. An instant's silence held the company, then from each man broke a soft subdued exclamation. The last throw showed the double 6. "Chance was always against you," remarked my lord. He picked up the ring and rose. Basil sat dumb and foolish. His usual sickly pallor had returned. He drummed on the table sharply. "I had a purpose of my own in this gamble," said my lord, very easy and grand, "which was not to ruin Sir Basil. Gentlemen, bear witness, he remains as he was master of all that for which he played here." My lord looked at Rue, who stood with her head down, "since the only item I value among Sir Basil's possessions was that one which I may not take." "Which is that?" asked the young man stupidly, ashamed and bewildered by this turn. "The last you offered," said my lord. Rue looked up at that. She was flushed and breathing hard, and looked as beautiful as a country rose. "If you mean my hand," she said, "it is yours. You may be a devil, as I make no doubt you are, but you are not a coward or a fool." Before them all she put her hand in his and he slipped the brass ring on her marriage finger. "You and I together, madame," he answered, "will make our way in the world." Sir Thomas Lawrence left a portrait of Ruth, Lady Muskerry, in a red velvet gown. Her robust beauty suited his facile brush, her frank face looks from the canvas radiant with health and success. Later he sketched Sir Basil, an old man at 30, ruined and weary. This drawing, however, was never finished, but remains in the artist's sketchbook. And in this case in the old museum chance has thrown the Cornelian ring, which was never mounted in gold after all. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I really hope you enjoyed it. There will be more to come. Please subscribe not to miss out on what is next. I will be looking forward to your return. The music is by Madfan from Pixabay. To support this and other artists, go to pixabay.com. Sheila.